Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the Moab incident, 2 Kings chapter 3. What I'd like to do is pause and go back to chapter 2 and notice the outline of the entire section. We had Elijah showing power over death. Instead of dying, he's caught up living into heaven, and Elisha gets to see him. And then after that, Elisha, we have his interaction with the sons of the prophets. They say, "We want to go search for the body of Elijah." And Elisha says, "You don't need to do that. Well, I'm caught up into heaven." And they actually put sort of a shame and guilt trip on him. And he says, "Fine, fine, go ahead and look." And they look, and of course, they don't find him because he's not there. Next, we have this instance in chapter 2, verses 19 through 22, where there is water at Jericho that is poisoned, and then that is the waters have a healing, and so that there's no more death in the water. And then we have that story of the boys that are mocking Elisha, and two she-bears come out and just mangle them and kill them. 42 of the boys are killed. Next, we have another water story. This time, we're going to see here in this chapter water provided in the Moabite campaign, and they'll see the water. It's actually going to have sort of a red tint to it, perhaps from the sun, perhaps from just the ground has got some reddish in the soil there. Um, and it's going to be mistaken for the death of the Israelites. There are those that they're going to think that's a sign of death. It's blood on the ground. Next, we'll see as we come to chapter 4, Elisha and the widow of a prophet. And it's going to be a multiplication story where oil will be multiplied to pay the creditors. Notice there's Elisha and the prophets, Elisha and the widow of a prophet. And finally, bringing us to conclusion, we have a story about power over death, where Elisha will raise the son of a Shunammite woman, and it's going to be a resurrection story. So we begin with power over death, and we end with power over death. With that background, that look into the bigger picture, now we want to begin looking at chapter 3, beginning in verse 1. Now Jehoram was the son of Ahab. Now Jehoram, the son of Ahab, became king over Israel at Samaria in the 18th year of Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, and reigned 12 years. He did evil in the sight of the Lord, though not like his father and mother, for he put away the sacred pillars of Baal, which his father had made. Nevertheless, he clung to the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, which he made Israel sin, and did not depart from them. So we had the northern kingdom of Israel ever since the days of Jeroboam, when Israel first split into two nations, with the northern kingdom of Israel, the southern kingdom of Judah. Ever since that time, you'd had idolatry, but it was an idolatry in how you worshiped God. So Jeroboam had set up two golden calves, one in Bethel and one in Dan, and the people had used that as a way to worship God. They weren't supposed to do that. That was idolatry. But Ahab had come along because of his wife Jezebel, and had gone one step further of not just worshiping God in a bad way, but worshiping this pagan god Baal. And Jehoram now says, we're not going to do that anymore. So here's sort of the line of kings. We've been looking at Israel, and we're down to the third dynasty that started with Omri, and then we had Ahab and Ahaziah. Remember, Ahaziah only reigned for 2 years. We saw his death in chapter 1. And now Jehoram, the brother to Ahaziah, is going to reign for a few years. Meanwhile, in Judah, we had Asa and Jehoshaphat and Jehoram. And you say, wait a minute, I've got the same name. There's a Jehoram in Judah and there's a Jehoram in Israel, and it's possible that one was named after the other, or because there's going to be actually some intermarriage that takes place. There's going to be an alliance, a marital alliance that will unite Israel and Judah. And of course, we've seen Elijah taken into heaven. Verse 4, now Mesha, king of Moab, was a sheep breeder and used to pay the king of Israel 100,000 lambs and the wool of 100,000 rams. But when Ahab died, the king of Moab rebelled against the king of Israel. So let's look at a map. Moab, notice it's on the east side of the Dead Sea, south of the Arnon River. And the story that we're going to read about here in 2 Kings chapter 3 is related to us in a archaeological find discovered by the Reverend F.A. Klein back in 1868. He discovered that what's been called the Moabite Stone. The stone was broken into pieces by Bedouins. So if you look at the stone, you see some parts in black. That's original. And then you see some parts in sort of a rustic color. The rustic color has been replaced because the stone was broken into pieces, and then the pieces that are in rustic, sort of a reddish look, they were lost. Those pieces were lost. You say, well, how were they able to reconstruct it? The good news is that Klein, before the stone was taken and broken up, he had taken wax paper and made a wax paper rubbing, preserving the complete inscription so it can be read. It has been translated, and it's made of black basalt and tells the story of what we're going to read about here in 2 Kings chapter 3, but from the Moabite point of view. And so here's a section from that. And Chemosh said to me, go take Nebo from Israel. And I went in the night and fought against it from the daybreak until midday. And I took it and I killed the whole population, 7,000 male subjects and aliens. So this rebellion, we're told, was not just a matter where they stopped paying their taxes. They actually captured a city and killed thousands of people, 7,000 male subjects and aliens and female subjects, aliens and servant girls, for I had put it to the ban for Ashtar Chemosh. And from there I took the vessels of Yahweh and I presented them before the face of Chemosh. Notice he's taken vessels that were dedicated to God, and he's taking them into the pagan temple. And the king of Israel had built Yahaz, and he stayed there throughout his campaign against me, and Chemosh drove him away before my face. Well, we'll continue now with the biblical account. We'll see how those two sort of line up together. Remember, you have two different perspectives. And King Jehoram went out of Samaria at that time and mustered all Israel. Then he went and sent word to Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, saying, the king of Moab has rebelled against me. Will you go with me to fight against Moab? And he said, that is, Jehoshaphat answers, I will go up. I am as you are, my people as your people, my horses as your horses. He is giving him the language of an alliance. We're going to take our two countries, because Israel in the north and Judah in the south have for hundreds of years now been two separate countries, and we're not going to combine the countries, but we're going to combine the armies, and we're going to work together, and we'll go forward in this military alliance. Verse 8, now they begin to plan out their campaign. He said, which way shall we go up? And he answered, the way of the wilderness of Edom. And so they're going to go through Judah and around the south end of the Dead Sea to come up against Moab. Why are they doing that? Because the north side of Moab is protected by that Arnon River. You see a river that flows into the Dead Sea. That's the Arnon. And that river actually has a very deep canyon. It's sort of like, sometimes they refer to it as the Grand Canyon of the Middle East. And even today, when you are driving from north to south, there's no bridges that span that river. It's far too wide for that. And instead, you make a large detour around it. Well, here they're making a detour around the southern end. And so we read that the king of Israel went with the king of Judah and the king of Edom. So it's not a two-party alliance, three-party alliance with Israel and Judah and Edom. And they made a circuit of 7 days' journey. And now here's the problem. There was no water for the army or for the cattle that followed them. The cattle are their sort of movable rations. They're going to take the cattle and kill cows and eat them as they need to feed the army. But there's no water, and you can do a few days without food. In the desert, you don't go very far at all without water. Verse 10, then the king of Israel said, alas, for the Lord has called these three kings to give them into the hand of Moab. Verse 11, but Jehoshaphat said, is there not a prophet of the Lord here, that we may inquire of the Lord by him? We saw Jehoshaphat take that same stance back at the end of First Kings, again when Israel and Judah were going off to war, that time against Aram. And again, Jehoshaphat is saying, let's ask a prophet, but let's ask a prophet from God. And one of the kings of Israel's servants answered and said, well, Elisha, the son of Shaphat, is here, who used to pour water on the hands of Elijah, and supposedly he's now a prophet. He's graduated from prophet assistant to full-blown prophet. Verse 12, Jehoshaphat said, the word of the Lord is with him. So the king of Israel and Jehoshaphat and the king of Edom went down to him. And now notice you're going to have a contrast between these two kings. You've got Jehoram, king of Israel, Jehoshaphat, king of Judah. Jehoram is going to assume that God has decreed the destruction of his confederation. That's what he said. God has brought us here to destroy us. Jehoshaphat says, well, let's check with the prophet to see what God has planned. Maybe that's the case. Maybe it's a different case. In Jehoram's case, he's assuming the worst of God. Jehoshaphat is wanting to hear the voice of God. Let God speak for himself. Let the prophet come and tell us what God is doing. And then Elisha gives his prophecy. And in his prophecy, it comes with a full set of instructions. The Israelites, Judah and Israel and Edom, they're told to dig trenches in the ground, which will be used to gather water. And he goes on to say, you shall not see wind, nor shall you see rain, yet that valley shall be filled with water. Now, sometimes that happens out in the desert, where you might have water all of a sudden shows up, and it might have rained 20, 30, 40 miles away, and that water just, it flows down these dry river areas looking for the trenches, the natural trenches, where they're going to make some artificial ones here. And it shows up, and there's not a cloud in the sky, there's no wind, there's no rain, but water comes. And that's what takes place here. Water streams in the desert. And Elisha also says, and not only that, but you're going to win against the Moabites. They're going to be given into your hand. Well, sure enough, verse 21, now all the Moabites heard that the kings had come up to fight against them, and all who were able to put on armor and older were summoned and stood on the border, and they rose early in the morning, and they're ready to fight, and the sun shone on the water. And the Moabites saw the water opposite them as red as blood. Now, was it red because sometimes when you have clouds in the sky and the sun is just coming up, you sort of have a reddish tint? It might have been that. Or it might be, you see that area around Edom and at the south end of Moab has some very red dirt. If you've ever seen pictures, for example, of Petra and some of the things that have been dug there, the dirt there, the rocks there have a reddish hue to them. And so what was the red costume? I don't know. But the Moabites saw the water and it looked red as though it was blood. And they jumped to the conclusion, oh, look at this. It's blood all over the ground. Verse 23, then they said, this is blood. The kings have surely fought together. You've got these three kings, these three armies, Israel and Judah and Edom. And when they're not allied with each other, sometimes they're fighting against each other, and they assume that's taken place. And they slain one another. Now, therefore, Moab to the spoil, and they come on the attack. Verse 24, but when they came to the camp of Israel, the Israelites hadn't been fighting anybody. They were ready for them. The Israelites arose and struck the Moabites, so that they fled before them, and they went forward into the land, slaughtering the Moabites. And just as Elisha had said, it was a great victory for the Israelites. Verse 26, and the king of Moab saw that the battle was too fierce for him. He took with him 700 men who drew swords to break through to the king of Edom, but they could not. He tries another military maneuver. That doesn't work out. And now, in a last-ditch effort, verse 27, then he took his oldest son, who was to reign in his place, the crown prince, and offered him as a burnt offering on the wall. He takes his son, the planned next king, and he takes him and executes him and kills him, offers him as a human sacrifice. And there came great wrath against Israel. Now, the passage says that, and yet we can take that probably in a few different ways. In what way does wrath come upon Israel? Is this the wrath of God? Is this the wrath of Kamosh? Is this the wrath of, I think that there's a certain consternation where Israel says, whoa, look at that. That's over and above. That's beyond. That's just too much for us. And notice the result. And they departed from him and returned to their own land. They look at that and they say, okay, enough is enough. I think we're done here. And what's interesting is when we look at the actions of this pagan king, we're reminded of something that takes place when we get to the New Testament, and the King of Heaven takes a parallel action. You see, this king offers up his son as a sacrifice on the walls of the city. And we come to the New Testament where Jesus is offered up, where God himself offers up his son as a sacrifice outside the walls of Jerusalem. Here in 2 Kings, this action brought great wrath against Israel. And when we get to the New Testament and see Jesus upon the cross, Christ took great wrath upon himself, the wrath that was against us, the wrath that was due us. He took upon himself. In 2 Kings chapter 3, this pagan king gained deliverance for his people as Israel packed up and these other armies packed up and left. When Christ went to the cross, he gained deliverance for the entire world, for all who believe in him. And he has become our deliverer as we are his people.